Land. It's a complicated and interesting topic, and an area which, in the spirit of this conference, is in dire need of reform. The aim of this presentation is to give a quick overview of the key facts about the context of land in Sri Lanka, so everyone is on the same page before our esteemed panelists take the stage. Issues relating to land have contributed to greatly reducing Sri Lanka's overall ranking on the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. Sri Lanka scored a very poor 51.9 out of 100 for property registration. World Bank officials found that having gone through the 8 processes required to register land over an average of 39 days, an individual or firm would incur a cost equivalent to 5.5% of the value of the property. For context, an individual registering land in Singapore would have to go through 6 processes that can be completed in just 4.5 days at an expenditure of 2.3% of property value. Also of note is the fact that 82% of land in Sri Lanka is government-owned. This is one of the highest in the world. Here are some key facts about Sri Lanka's land distribution, both in terms of land area and in terms of land area by climatic zone. Of the total 65,600 square kilometers, the majority is classified as agricultural land. By zone, most of the land area of the country is in the dry zone. Note that forest area counts all of the land classified by the authorities as a forest, and not the actual tree cover itself. There's a distinction that becomes clear in slide 6. This slide provides a significant amount of information about Sri Lanka's population, economic activity, and how it relates to our natural geography. There is clearly an agglomeration of people, infrastructure, and economic activity in the southwest wet zone and in the intermediate zones. This agglomeration began occurring largely in the 18th century and later, as the capital of the country switched to Colombo under the colonial powers. As a result of this agglomeration, there was a significant amount of deforestation, as land converted to urban and agricultural applications. This continued in the wet zone until a ban on logging was imposed in 1988, which is why there is so little forest cover despite favorable conditions for plant growth. Indeed, the only parts of the wet and intermediate zones where there is still significant forest cover and limited infrastructure, agriculture, and population density is in the high elevation areas. These are areas above 500 meters from sea level where there is likely limited economic incentive to settle. On the top left, you can see Sri Lanka's current land use. The bottom left and the right of the slide show the change in land use in Sri Lanka between 2000 and 2020. Notable land use conversions can be seen from agriculture to settlements. These are the red patches. In addition, significant transformations can be seen from bare land to agriculture, yellow patches, in both decades. Agriculture land use to settlement land use conversions were 485 kilometers squared from 2000 to 2010, and 1,536 kilometers squared from 2010 to 2020. Further, significant land use conversions can be seen from bare lands to agricultural lands and forest lands in both decades, approximately 6,000 kilometers squared in total. Population growth and finishing the civil war can be 2 possible reasons for these land use conversions. It should be noted that water sources have remained fairly stable despite the developments of the last 2 decades. This is a positive sign that bodes well for Sri Lanka's future water security and supply. This slide shows an overview of the forest land situation in Sri Lanka. There is slightly more state ownership of forest lands than the national average for all lands. As seen from the forest land breakdown, slightly over 20% of the land classified as forest does not actually consist of forest cover. The map on the right shows the different types of forest cover in Sri Lanka. It should be noted that although overall forest cover in Sri Lanka still remains at over 34%, a significant amount of the dense lowland rainforest that originally covered much of the wet and intermediate zones has been lost. On the top left of this slide is a breakdown of how agricultural land is used. The major plantation crops, which include tea and rubber, predominantly consist of export crops. From the top right, you can see that agriculture still contributes to 25% of employment, a significant percentage. However, there is low productivity in this sector, which contributes to the low but still significant contribution to GDP of around 7%. By comparison, China, which also has approximately 25% of the population in agriculture, obtains 16.5% of GDP from it. One reason for this low productivity and output is excessive state involvement in agricultural policy. The state both directs farmers on what types of crop they can grow and on how large their farms are. A result of this is that average farm sizes have been steadily falling, particularly since the 1972 land reforms, which has been causing fragmentation and low productivity growth. This also limits incomes for farmers, particularly when they are directed to grow low-value crops. Sri Lanka is one of the least urbanized countries in the world at 18.1% urbanization by official metrics. However, this may be due to current administrative practices and methods of classifying urban areas. Currently, only those living in areas with urban councils or municipal councils are considered as urban population. Independent experts have calculated that the actual figure, when accounting for agglomeration, is around 45% of the population. In any case, most of our urbanization has occurred over the last 20 years, and particularly in the post-war period, as seen from the diagram above. In fact, Sri Lanka had the highest rate of urbanization in the region from 1999 to 2010, and this has traditionally followed the ribbon development type. In other words, along established roads and highways. Predominantly, the population and urbanization in the country is concentrated in the western province, which accounts for almost 40% of GDP. Sri Lanka's extremely high state land ownership is the result of colonial land policies and subsequently the 1972 land reforms, which imposed a ceiling of land ownership of 20 hectares that still exists to this day. As the statistics on the bottom show, there were many negative impacts as a result of these reforms, and some of their objectives, such as to provide land to the landless, still have not been accomplished today. The 11 to 21% reduction in land value is assessed by the World Bank. It comes about because farmers, who often do not have the full freehold titles to their land, cannot utilize its full value as collateral for loans for investment, which will potentially reduce the future output of the agricultural sector. Degradation of land occurs as a result of high state land ownership. Farmers and even plantations and companies do not really have an incentive to properly preserve their land, as they only have it on a short-term lease. Meanwhile, encroachment on state lands remains high and has contributed to our high deforestation rates, particularly in the wet and intermediate zones. The 1970s land reforms expanded upon the Land Development Ordinance and introduced the Land Reform Act, both of which contributed to our high state land ownership at present. A significant amount of this land was expropriated from foreign corporations, sometimes without payment. Although that land was supposed to be redistributed to the landless, as you can see from the chart on the right, it was primarily redistributed to public agencies and cooperatives, often at the expense of productivity. Sri Lanka's productivity in a number of export crops, such as tea, fell, and they did not recover until privatization reforms were implemented many years later. As the statistics on the bottom show, these reforms greatly reduced the rights of farmers and have had other negative consequences. Finally, BOI zones. BOI zones primarily consist of export processing zones, though industrial parks and industrial zones are also significant. At present, there are 3,800 acres devoted to BOI zones, a figure that is expected to double with new public-private partnership EPZs being planned. BOI zones greatly punch above their weight. They contribute, although they only employ around 6% of the total workforce, they contribute to 42% of total export revenues, particularly from the textile and garment sectors. However, many BOI zones, such as the EPZ in Katunayaka, are currently operating near or at full capacity. It is therefore imperative to expand the capacity of these zones, to construct new ones, and to implement policy to liberalize trade and simplify tax structures in the hope of replicating the success of these zones island-wide. On that note, I'll bring this presentation to a close. Thank you for your attention.